Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on Lake George Radio, 93.5 FM, and live streaming at lakegeorgeradio.com. Here's the president of the Lake George Battlefield Alliance, John DiNuzzo.
Hi, this is John DiNuzzo of Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, and we welcome you again to our little segment here on Lake George Radio. Today we're going to talk about the anniversary of the Patriots' capturing of Fort George, and it actually happened on May the 11th, 1775. And to share the information about that with us will be our Bruce Venter, who's the historian and trustee for the Battlefield Park Alliance. Bruce, what happened?
Well, I want to set the stage in terms of the bigger picture of what's going on in this area and why they captured Fort George. The colonies had been simmering for 10 years after the Stamp Act, and they wanted to eventually bolt from the mother country. We had Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world, April 19th, 1775. This is going to start the American Revolution. But there's a fella up in what they call the Hampshire Grants, which is now called Vermont. His name is Ethan Allen, and he has lived up in those Hampshire Grants for a number of years. He is thinking about that fort at Ticonderoga and how if they can get a hold of that fort, it will be something that the British will not be able to use as a staging area to come into the Hampshire Grants or to come south into the colony of New York. He gets some of his people together. We all call them the Green Mountain Boys. Some call them vagabonds, some call them ruffians, some call them the Bennington Mob. But Ethan Allen wants to get a hold of that fort because in his own mind, his people, the Green Mountain Boys, will benefit from that. And so he also has a conversation with a man named John Brown, who should be important to people in this area because John Brown becomes a colonel and he will eventually get involved in the campaign of 1777. But that gets ahead of my story. Ethan Allen, John Brown decide to take the Green Mountain Boys on May the 9th and march from Bennington to Hand's Cove, which is on the east side of Lake Champlain. Their purpose is to cross the lake and capture Fort Ticonderoga, which has a corporal's guard taking care of the fort. Actually, it's a captain and a lieutenant and about 45 men. But these men are sort of broken down soldiers that nobody else wants. Now, the British actually know that there's a possibility that this fort could be captured, but they don't take any precautions. Also who comes along is a man that everyone in America knows, Benedict Arnold. And Benedict Arnold has been negotiating over in Massachusetts with the provincial Congress, and he wants to capture Fort Ticonderoga. And they make him a colonel in the Massachusetts militia, and they give him some upfront money. They tell him to recruit 400 men. He doesn't have time to do that. He rides as fast as he can to get up to Castleton. He does catch up with Ethan Allen at Hand's Cove, and he insists that he's going to be part of this. He's going to command, actually, the capture of Ticonderoga. Well, Ethan Allen wants no part of this. Ethan Allen has also, with his Green Mountain Boys, decided at the same time to capture Steensboro, which you may know is Whitehall. He also wants to capture Fort George, which gets back to the anniversary date that John mentioned. And so it's a pretty ingenious strategy for a country bumpkin, if you consider Ethan Allen wasn't well educated. He didn't go to the Ivy League colleges like John Adams and like that. But he's a very savvy guy. And so he will orchestrate this strategy to capture Ticonderoga, capture Steensboro, and also capture Fort George, which eventually gives the Patriots a straight line from Albany all the way up to Canada. And that's why the capture of Fort George is important, because it's that link. There were a few people, a couple soldiers there at Fort George. You know, they probably would have eventually captured it anyway, but to have it all come together on 9, 10, 11 in 1775 in the month of May was really extraordinary. And I'm glad that we're going to celebrate May the 11th.
So as part of the whole 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, which really kicks off next year, we're going to be commemorating this historic takeover of Fort George by the Patriots in some detail. And certainly as we get later next year, we'll talk more about the heroics of Henry Knox, for example, Henry Knox and his noble artillery train that transported cannon all the way from Ticonderoga to Boston to relieve Washington and really enable him to bully the British out of Boston, a very key part of the early stages of the Revolution.
America's History LLC, my company, is doing a Henry Knox tour in June.
Right?
Yes, and we're going to follow the noble train of artillery from Ticonderoga all the way over to Springfield this year, and then we'll follow it from Springfield to Boston next year. So the foremost expert on Henry Knox, Dr. Philip Hamilton, who spoke here in Lake George, leading the tour.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on Lake George Radio, 93.5 FM, and live streaming at lakegeorgeradio.com. If you have any questions regarding Lake George Battlefield Moments, email info@lakegeorgebattlefield.org. And tune in every Saturday morning at 9:45 for Lake George Battlefield Moments.